Hi everyone, my name is Greg Ford and let's get started. And we have a really interesting webinar for you today. It's entitled How to Identify Job Applicants Who Will Fit With Your Culture and Values. And judging by the number of people who signed up for this, it seems to be a topic that is really resonating with people. So let's get started. This will be about a 30 to possibly 45-minute webinar. It depends on how many questions people have at the end. So there will be a chance for you to ask questions. If you look in your dashboard, it's under the little tab called Questions. And this will be recorded as well. So it will be available for you to review later or to pass along to others as well within your organization. So I have a question before we get going. How many of you have ever hired someone who you thought was going to be a great employee and a great fit with the culture, only to find out about 6 months later that this person just isn't a good fit at all? It's happened to all of us, hasn't it? So why is it that we always understand this after they've been hired? And it's a real big problem for organizations, which we'll talk about today. That's the focus of this. So this is me. Now, this is my background. I do have an undergrad degree in psychology. My master's degree is in workplace learning, and I'm one of the co-founders here at TalentClick, along with Stephen Race, who's an occupational psychologist. And we've been getting lots of attention in what we're doing in personality assessments and, of course, values and attitude assessments as well. If you don't know much about TalentClick, just a brief explanation. We do work with organizations around the world in about 15 different languages, and we service all kinds of industries. We're kind of industry agnostic. It could be natural resources, transportation. We have customers in healthcare. We have customers in retail, hospitality, and so on. And it's not just big companies as well. We have quite a number of small to mid-sized organizations that also are really concerned about finding the right fit with their organization. So this is what we're going to cover today. We'll just briefly touch on what are assessments if you haven't been using them in the past and you want to understand a bit more about what this topic is, and then really roll up our sleeves on what is person-organization fit. And I'll explain what that is as opposed to job fit. It's about fitting with the organization and the culture and values. Then we'll dive into understanding the different work values that we measure. And finally, what do you do with it? How do we apply the knowledge? I'm also going to announce some new research results. And you can see that I've got some blanks here. I'm not going to give you the results of this until a bit later. I'm just kind of teasing you with it right now. But it's really fascinating when we look at research that organizations have given us. And these are performance metrics they've provided, and then we correlate the results against the different dimensions that we measure, such as integrity, responsibility, coachability, positive attitude. And there's an absolute direct correlation between people who score high or low on these dimensions and the rates of incidents, such as getting high performance reviews, getting into issues of absenteeism, even theft, fraud, violence, injuries, and so on. So I'll tell you more about that as we go. So why should you pay attention? Why does this matter? Well, at the end of the day, when you hire based not only on person-job fit, but also on the person-organization fit, we get happier employees, and there's higher engagement. And teams can be more effective and productive. There's decreased employee turnover, which means less hiring and training. You can have fewer headaches and more time for other things, and you can have higher job satisfaction as well. You deserve it, and you can look like a rock star too. So one thing I want to make clear is it's not just about metrics and engagement by finding people at the attraction stage. This is also about retention. This is also about getting people who fit within your organization so that existing employees are happy, not just new employees. Because when the existing ones get introduced to, let's say, a toxic presence, they're not going to be happy, and they may want to start looking for work elsewhere. Somebody explained it to me as organ rejection. The organ that's getting transplanted and the body is rejecting this new organ doesn't affect just that one organ. It can affect all organs in the body. All right, so let's get into part one, the background on assessment. So we won't spend that much time in it, but If you work in HR, these are the different functions that we have to deal with, of course. And at Talent Click, we focus on just the one area. We're not experts in all things. It's really about the recruitment hiring stage. We do some that pertains to the orange box, training and development. But really what we're focusing on today is the recruitment and the hiring. And within that function, we're focusing on more of the testing side of things. And within testing, there could be skills testing, aptitude, personality assessments, cognitive testing. And what we're really talking about today is the integrity and the values for the culture fit. So it's a big issue when we look at some of the ramifications when we get it wrong. The cost of employee turnover can range from 25% to 200% of annual compensation. I read that even lower level minimum wage workers, when there's turnover, it costs about $5,000 to $6,000 per person. And some organizations have not just dozens, but hundreds of people at that level that are turning over, voluntary turnover or through terminations. Cost of workplace violence, it's a $36 billion a year issue. And theft and fraud, look at that, $600 billion a year issue. It's enormous. So what we're after here is obviously hiring better top performers. And McKinsey & Company says that hiring a top performer over an average performer yields up to 67% higher productivity and profit. Wouldn't we all like to see yields like that? So one of the issues, of course, is people will tell you in an interview that, oh yeah, sure, I'm positive, responsible, honest, ethical, coachable, and so on. But after you get them in the job, which path will they take? That's the guesswork. And traditional interviewing literally has a coin toss success rate in hiring people who become good or top performers. We think we're good at reading people, but the research shows that we're not. An unstructured interview has a 50% success rate. Well, why is this? Well, when you look at a resume at the hiring stage, we can look at the past experience, skills, education, and so on. If we do interview them, we can see how they look and how they talk. We can go ahead and do the background check and the reference checks. And make no mistake, we should still keep doing those things. But what we can't see are what we call, with personality, the natural impulses, the urges and tendencies. We call it our natural hardwiring or default settings. It leads to knee-jerk reactions. Another way to think of personality is how someone acts when nobody is watching. So that's personality. Now let's look at values and attitude. What else you can't see is typically someone's honesty, trustworthiness, reliability, their ethics, morals, principles, positive attitude, how open are they to communication, how open are they to others. This is something else that we can help with. So as I just said, keep doing the background checks and reference checks. They are necessary. But one of the issues is those things focus only on the past, on what's already happened. And using only those tools to hire is like driving by only looking in the rearview mirror. So more and more companies, in fact 60 to 70% of Fortune 500 companies, are now using employee assessments for hiring. It used to be about half that number. It was 30 to 35%. About 15 years ago. And the reason for that is they were manually labor intensive. So the candidate sat with the bubble sheet and filled in the scores, and then a psychologist had to take away and use an answer key to mark it and then type up a report. And because of that, it took a long time, and also it was very expensive. And both of those issues are being addressed by many, many assessment organizations around the world, including ours. So there's kind of a tidal wave of interest in using assessments now. And the other thing is they do work. Now, I'm not here to say that assessments in general bring that 50% success rate up to 100%. That would be foolish. We aim to get it up to around a 75% mark. Assessments are not the be-all and end-all. They're just one piece of the hiring decision-making process. But going from 50% success rate to 75%, that's pretty darn good. That's a 50% incremental gain. And that's one of the reasons big companies are now using it more and more. Let's move on to part two. What is person-organization fit versus PJ fit, which is person-job fit? When we look at the foundation, The values are really the foundation of everything. This is the organization's culture and what they stand for, what the mission is. And we know, as I said right at the beginning, we know when someone just doesn't fit. Sometimes it's hard to articulate why, but we just have this gut sense. So person-organization fit, the definition is how an individual matches an organization's values, goals, and the mission. It's broadly defined as the compatibility between people and organizations. So do you know what your organization's core values are? Many people do, others don't. And if you don't, that's okay. There are tools out there to measure culture and values. There are culture assessments, there's engagement surveys, employee satisfaction surveys. There's all kinds of tools out there. And they act as a gap analysis between what management thinks is going on and what is really going on. And this session today is not about measuring the corporate culture and values. We just don't have enough time to talk about that. But there are a number of good tools out there, and we have one as well, which can be used to really get a read on what is truly happening, not just what we think is happening. So keep in mind, person-organization fit is not about plugging those gaps once you do a gap analysis. It's not about plugging the gaps with diversity and hiring people of different opinions and colorful personalities who complement one another. Those things are important, don't get me wrong, but it's more than that. So in contrast to PJ assessments, PO assessments are for all positions to assess culture fit. Characteristics desired in all members of the organization, regardless of the role, the alignment with the organizational values, the potential to put themselves and or others at the risk of employee turnover, fraud, theft, violence, harassment, injuries, all those negative things that we want to avoid. The reasons for expanding the employee selection criteria beyond the person job fit to include the PO fit include the need to maintain or improve organizational culture by hiring people who fit. The employees change jobs frequently, so they need traits applicable across different jobs in the organization. That's what the company needs. Employees are often required to complete tasks outside of their job descriptions, so we should assess beyond job fit to the current role. You look at any job description, what's the very last line on it? Other duties as required. So this is it. Often we're asked to do things beyond what the typical job description is, and those things often do tie into the organization as a whole. Now, if you haven't used assessments in the past, how does this work? What's the process? I'll briefly explain it. So typically an organization can email an invitation to someone to do an assessment, or there can be a link on their careers page so that they automatically ask people to log in and do it. Most assessments these days are much shorter. They should only be about 10 to 20 minutes long, and they should be available in multiple languages. They need to be written at a basic reading level. It's important that they're non-invasive and there's no adverse impact. That's especially important for our US folks who have EEOC compliance requirements. And it should be that these days with software algorithms that the reports are turned around very quickly. Typically within one day, hours are turned around within 1 hour, by the way. Now, it just so happens that our 10 to 15 minute assessment, the one survey generates 4 different reports. And I'm not going to talk about all these reports. We do have the WPP, which is a general assessment. We've got a couple of safety assessments. But the one that I'm going to talk about today is indeed the values and attitude assessment, which correlates to culture. And this is the one that measures integrity. Does someone have a sense of responsibility? Are they coachable? Do they have a positive attitude? And so on. And this is what the summary page of that report looks like. So there you can see the dimensions that I've been referring to, the integrity, the responsibility, and so on. And I'll dive into each of these in depth very shortly. A good report should also include interview questions. So it's not just giving you the summary data and saying, good luck. It's, what do you do with it? How can you receive practical tools that create more meaningful, let's say, interviews? And that's one of the things that we provide, are interview questions. So I said let's get into the actual dimensions. So we'll go through each of these very quickly, and then we'll talk about the application of the knowledge. So the first one's integrity, fairly self-explanatory. It's about whether people are respectful of rules, do they have higher importance on honesty, principles, and ethics. The next one is about a sense of responsibility. So responsible people take commitments seriously. They're punctual, they strive to meet others' expectations. Coachability is about people being open to change, responding positively to suggestions for improvement. Uncoachable people often think that their way is better, and they're quite resistant to others telling them what to do. Do you know anyone like that? I certainly do, and I can sometimes be that way myself. Positive attitude. So positive people tend to be quite optimistic, and they think favorably about situations, even when there's some adversity going on, whereas the negative folks tend to get annoyed by others, especially when they're feeling stressed. Aggression control is interesting, and this isn't just an issue in more blue-collar industrial settings. It can be in white-collar settings as well, where we get these aggressive people actively being physically confrontational or even verbally confrontational with folks. And sometimes it's the people that you don't expect it to be. So open communication is important as well. Almost every organization has this as one of their values, that they're really communicating well, they collaborate and so on, but how do you know if someone's going to be like that? The open people do tend to be trusting and approachable, and they'll initiate contact with others, while closed people do tend to be more suspicious and secretive, and they hold others at a distance. So that's a quick run through of the different dimensions on our work values and attitude assessment, the WVA. I said the most important part of this webinar is really rolling up the sleeves and getting to the application of the knowledge. So that's what we're going to talk about right now. What do you do with that data once you know how someone scores? So there's different tools for maximizing success when hiring. Obviously, what's important is going around talking to the line managers or stakeholders saying, what does it take to excel in the position? Who will be the best fit on the team and in the department? And a good question to ask is, who will not fit? Tell me about the people who have not worked out in the past. Sometimes people can articulate that much better. And here are the tools. We obviously have the job description, and it's important to map to the job description when we're looking at the assessments. Group analytics can be another really good way to benchmark who the top performers are in an organization, and I'll show you that in a second. And then, of course, view the actual assessment results on each individual and look at how their results map to the benchmark ideal scores. And finally, as I touched on earlier, using those tailored interview questions, as opposed to a one-size-fits-all bank of interview questions, it's much more meaningful to ask those tailored, specific, personalized questions according to the results of each individual. And I will talk about that in a second as well. So here's the first one, mapping requirements to the dimension. When you're talking to people, or when you're thinking about what does the job require and what's the culture like here, think about, is this a rules-driven environment? Are we bureaucratic? Are we heavily process-oriented? And if so, that's fine. But that might mean that a different person is required. Also, is there a danger of theft or fraud? Is honesty important? Well, if the answers to those things are yes, then you need to focus more on someone who has a score that's high on integrity. How many other people will be counting on this person? Is punctuality important? Do they need that sense of responsibility? If so, that's the dimension that you should be paying attention to. How much learning will there be? Is there a lot of change? Do you need someone who's adaptable, who's constantly going to be coached by someone? Well, then coachability is important, as opposed to that person who's quite resistant to change and thinks that their way is best. How much adversity is there? Will they be dealing with customers? Are they dealing with customers who are complaining a lot of the time? Well, you probably need someone with a positive attitude. That's a dimension to focus on. You need that person who is quite calm and feels empathy towards others, as opposed to not caring about others quite as much. Is conflict common? Have there been verbal and physical confrontations before? If so, you need someone who can control their aggression. And there are two kinds of aggressive people. There are those people that are hot-blooded, and they only get, lose their temper when they're triggered by specific events, as opposed to the cold-blooded individual who is almost a little bit more of that sociopathic personality, and they take pleasure in others' misfortune. They actually enjoy provoking others. And there are not many people like that in society, but when you do work with someone like that, watch out, because they are not coachable. They will not change their behaviors. How open, trusting, and collaborative is the work environment? If so, you need that person who is very open. They're not secretive. They will trust others and collaborate. Okay, so that's mapping the requirements to these dimensions we're going to talk about. There are dozens and dozens of other questions. These are only examples, but I think you get the point. The exercise is to really figure out what's important in the organization. What's the culture like? What do we expect? Is this a culture of openness? Or is it okay to be a little more secretive and just go work in a corner? We don't pass judgment on any of these things. It's really all about mapping to fit with the organization. We've had companies in the past that have always wanted to hire people that, for instance, are go-getters. They're high achievers. They're highly flexible and adaptable, because that's the direction the company wanted to move in. But when they hired some of those people, 6 months later, some of those people were leaving because the company hadn't moved the needle enough in the direction of where they wanted to go. Their culture hadn't changed yet. So they actually should have been hiring people that were more, a little more attuned to the old way, the old culture. Hope that makes sense. So the next tool I talked about was the group analytics. And this is interesting. So you see in the bottom right, all those little dots, they're actually diamonds, are an individual person's score. And we can do this with any assessment. We can do this with the WVA or anything. But what's interesting is now you've got a scatter plot graph where you've got all kinds of different individuals, and you can identify patterns and trends. You can see where the scores are clustering. You can see where you might have issues now. You can map where your top performers are falling. And so that's the green box. If you have enough of these top performers that are scoring more towards, let's say, the calm dimension on this particular assessment, that's what you want to create a benchmark score, more in that area. And so here's a benchmark score. Each of those orange horizontal lines is the ideal target score, the benchmark range for each of these dimensions. This is, of course, just an example. These ranges would be narrower or wider, depending on your culture and your values. And that little starburst, the orange and white marker, is the individual person's score. And of course, those can be anywhere along that spectrum from left to right. So if the person scores within that benchmark range, that's ideal. Now, I want to make something clear. Just because someone scores outside of the range on a few of these, it doesn't mean it's a knockout. We always say don't use any assessment as a pass or fail. Every assessment should only be used as about maybe 20–25% of the entire decision-making process. As I said earlier, keep interviewing, keep doing the background screening and the background checks, reference checks, and the skills testing, and whatever else you need to do. So ideally, you do want them to fall into as many of the ideal score ranges as possible, but as I said, if they don't use it as a knockout. All right? So we're going to look at this in a little more depth in a second. I want to go through a few use case scenarios. So this is where the rubber meets the road. Let's say you are recruiting for a financial services company that handles sensitive personal information. There have been problems in the past with employees breaching confidentiality rules. So think about that for a second. Now you're interviewing a new potential hire, an account manager named John Doe. What would you probe into during an interview? Now, I just showed you questions to ask to map to the dimensions on the values and attitude assessment. So think about this. What we're dealing with personal information, sensitive, confidential material. So obviously, oh, this is a nice softball for you. We want to focus on integrity. So when you go back and look at the person results, you ideally want to see that John's score on integrity is quite high. And in this case it is, so it's a green go. Now, of course, you want to look at the other dimensions as well. He scores high in responsibility, that's great. But for this particular use case, we've got a tick box that his integrity is pretty darn high. If it wasn't high, or even if it was high and you still want to confirm things, you may want to go to the interview questions section of the report and then use these specific interview questions to really delve into things. So in this case, it could be, John, sometimes here at XYZ company, we need to bend the rules a bit in order to get things done. Give me an example of a time when you needed to do this. Or, John, we never bend the rules here. It's absolutely critical that everyone adheres to the standard operating procedures. Give me an example of a time when you wanted to bend the rules, but you just knew you couldn't. So I think you get the point of how these things can be adapted according to the culture, but according to this person's score as well. Now it becomes, as I said, not a one-size-fits-all behavioral interview, but it's adapted to this person's unique scores. Let's look at another scenario. So use case 2, during an interview, you might be recruiting for, let's say, a dynamic tech company, a software company, where continuous learning is essential to keep up with competitors in the industry. It's always changing. And you are interviewing a project manager named, let's call her Lynn. What would you probe into during the interview? So the hints again are that it's a dynamic tech company. Things are changing all the time. There's continuous learning. And so one of the things you might focus on is the coachability because of the continuous learning. You're hiring someone that has to listen to maybe not just one supervisor, but a number of different stakeholders that are constantly coming to Lynn saying, we need to do it differently, or I would recommend you change it and do it like this. So on the report, we would key in on, of course, things like integrity, responsibility, maybe aggression control. Those all tick the boxes. As I said, this one, coachability, is pretty darn important. And in this case, Lynn's score is kind of low. So what do we do with that? Again, it might not be a knockout. Let's ask some interview questions based on coachability. So Lynn, give me an example of a time when you changed a behavior or stopped a bad habit. What was it and what did you do to change? Or, Lynn, give me an example of something about yourself you'd like to improve. What would you like to do? You may find that by interviewing Lynn with these questions, you may hear that she is self-aware. She knows that she is a little more resistant to change and doesn't like to be micromanaged or coached. However, knowing that about herself, she has learned to adapt. She's learned to bite her tongue and to be more collaborative and be more coachable. Or you may not hear that. You may hear that, nope, she is very resistant, and in that case, this score is definitely a red flag. There's no question. All right, let's look at another use case. And now moving beyond the interview, let's look at a reference check scenario. Let's say you're recruiting for a retail organization. You need to hire a customer service manager who handles escalated customer complaints. So it's essential to maintain the company value of, we please every customer. You need to avoid confrontation and conflict with customers and resolve complaints to their liking. The customer is always right, whether we agree with that or not. So you're interviewing a candidate named Antonio. What would you probe into, not just during the reference check, or sorry, the interview, but now during the reference check? So if we look at this, we think it's a retail organization, that's a customer service job, lots of complaints. It can be kind of a negative position, always deflecting fastballs. You have to please people to their liking. So there could be a number of different things. Now, it may not just be one thing. It could be that sense of responsibility. It could be assessing whether they have a positive attitude, because that's the culture. And you need someone who can control their aggression and not lash out verbally at these customers that are always complaining and never seem to be satisfied. Okay, so those are the things I said we would key on with this use case. So let's look at these: responsibility, positive attitude. Okay, those tick the boxes, but maybe aggression control, it's not super low, it's actually in the middle. And by the way, this middle, this is a normative assessment, so it is the general population. So right in the middle, 50th percentile is 50th percentile within the general population of people. So half the folks are above, half are below. So in this case, Antonio's right in the middle. Not necessarily a red flag, but you might want to dig into things. So going back to those interview questions, it could be for that sense of responsibility. You ask something about, tell me about a time when you demonstrated that you're a dependable worker. Sometimes we're given deadlines that are too short. Tell me about the time when you needed extra time to complete a task. So that's for responsibility. For aggression control, there are other questions you could ask as well. And sorry, with a reference check, you could ask the person you're doing a reference check with is, I'm looking at this report right now. It's telling me that Antonio may sometimes have an issue with controlling his temper. Is that the case? And you know what's interesting? Often you'll find that person who's doing the reference check will say, oh, how do you know that? That's interesting. So now it goes beyond just the simple strengths and weaknesses. What do you like about Antonio? Would you hire him again? To really rolling up the sleeves on particular personality traits and values and attitude and so on. And you may get this reference check say to you, you know what, Antonio was really good about biting his tongue, counting to 10, not taking things personally, realizing that if somebody flew off the handle with him, it wasn't them being angry at him, it was just angry at the situation. So you have a good dialogue about this particular dimension now, about aggression control. Conversely, what you might hear is, yeah, that can be an issue sometimes with Antonio, and he just never learned to deal with it. And I tried to coach him, and he still hadn't learned to deal with it very well. That could be a major red flag, and it might mean you want to focus on the other candidates first. Okay? So hopefully this all makes sense, and what we're working towards, right from a high level, is what we've discussed: increasing those positive events, the increased efficiency, productivity, team morale, building the employee satisfaction and customer satisfaction, and decreasing the negative events. And it could be the employee absenteeism or turnover. It could be the violence, theft, customer complaints, you name it. There's lots of things to think about. And that's really, at the end of the day, what we're looking at is moving the needle. It's not just giving people nice reports and saying good luck. It has to increase their positive or negative metrics. And at the end of the day, back to what we talked about earlier, the general summary on things is behaviors are indeed based on values and attitude. They are predictable. They are absolutely predictable. And they're measurable as well. So it's important to hire not just on person job fit, but person organization fit, so that your team can be more effective, you can have fewer headaches and more time for other things, you can have higher job satisfaction, you can look like a rock star. We talked about those things earlier, and I really wanted to finish with them because it's all about you. So we do have time for a few questions now. And as I mentioned earlier, if you can go to the questions tab, if there are any, I will read them out and deal with those. If not, I'm going to call a wrap to things, and you're welcome to contact me directly. There's my email address. My phone number is there as well. I can answer questions, or I may hand them off to one of the team members here who can get back to you either via email or telephone, whatever your preference might be. Okay? So I do see a question here, and I'll read that. Another question is, can I get a copy of the presentation? Absolutely. So we have recorded this, and Liz will be sending out a follow-up link to each individual, and we'll include a link to the presentation itself. to the recording, but also the slides if you need to use them. Somebody's asked about contacting us about pricing options. Yeah, happy to talk about that. I don't want to bring that up right now because it sounds like we're focused on selling you, and we're not. Really, we just want to give you some good information right now. So contact us directly about the pricing. Okay, so here's a good question from Paul. If a person has a high degree of self-awareness about a certain trait and has worked at adapting, will they test the same as someone who hasn't? I love that question. The answer is typically yes. And the reason for that is the way we've built assessments in general, whether it's the work values or the personality assessment, the way we ask the questions, it's generally not that evident what we're measuring, what we're assessing. So generally people will answer in a way that does reveal their true self, okay? So hopefully that answers that. Another thing I want to make clear with this is, just as with personality assessments, it's the same with work values and attitude. We don't usually change. We can gain a self-awareness, which helps us interrupt our usual patterns of behavior, and we might act differently based on knowing ourselves and monitoring our own actions. But our personality doesn't change. Our values don't change. Our impulse and our knee-jerk reactions are a function of who we are. Now, personality can change very quickly, or values can change very quickly if there's been a life-altering event, for an example, a fatality. But generally, we are anchored in our personality and values from how we are born. We're born a certain way. And if any of you have kids or nieces and nephews, you know that we can grow up in the same household, but we can be very different kids, and that's a function of who we are. It's how we're born. We don't pass judgment on how we're born. It's all about fit to the position, but as I've been emphasizing in this discussion today, it's fit with the organization and the culture as well. Just looking at another question. I think, yeah, we do have I mentioned we have the report available, or sorry, the presentation available as well. Liz will send that out. Is there a way to determine if a person is answering questions based on social desirability? So good question. So as I mentioned a few seconds ago, generally the questions are phrased in a way that it's not evident what they're measuring. Sometimes people can guess, but we do have what we call lie indicators or falsification indicators built into it, and we can generally detect when people are trying to game the survey, so to speak. So the research shows that these assessments are generally about 95% accurate. So that's pretty darn good. Now there is a 5% variance. And once in a while you get someone who, can kind of game it a little bit, but it's quite rare. And the second thing is, most of the time people, especially if they're applying to a job, they typically want to do things right and answer the proper way. Once again, sometimes you'll get the person who doesn't, and that's kind of an indication of what we're talking about today, maybe being a little bit lower on integrity. Okay, we're around the 40-minute mark, right in the target range of 30 to 45 minutes, and I don't see any other questions, so I'm going to call a stop today, and I'm going to, in a second, stop the recording. But I just want to thank you once again for your attention and interest. Hopefully you found this a really interesting presentation. It's an important topic, it really is, and we all know what it's like when somebody fits with the culture and when somebody doesn't fit with the culture. We just feel it, don't we? And that's what we're here to really help with. And hopefully you've got some more tools and knowledge today to go forth and predict when we've got that great individual who's going to be a great fit with the culture in the future. So thanks everyone, and have a great day. Take care.